Fucking people out there, Roderick. You don't want to lick it on, don't buy it. You don't want to get addicted, don't abuse it. They're mad because we made it available and desirable. Hey, newsflash, it's our only fucking job. These people, they want an entire meal for $5 in 5 minutes, and then they complain it's made of shit and plastic. McDonald's would serve nothing but kale salad all day and all night long. That's what people fucking ate. It's available, no one buys it. I will get around to funding AIDS research and diabetes and heart disease just as soon as we figure out how to keep our geriatric dicks harder for a few more minutes. What's the market share on wimpy dicks, Roderick? 60-70% of the healthcare industry. The Pentagon spent $83 million on Viagra last year. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, the fucking Supreme Court, does its part, tears the autonomy, rips the liberty away from women, shreds not just their choice, but their future, their potential. We turn men into cum fountains and women into factories, cranking out what? An impoverished workforce there for the labor and to spend what little they make consuming. And what do we teach them to want? Houses they can't afford, cars that poison the air, single-serve plastics, clothes made by starving children in third world countries. And they want it so bad that they're begging for it, they're screaming for it, they're insisting upon it. And we're the problem. These fucking monsters, these fucking consumers, these fucking mouths. They point at you and me like we're the problem. They fucking invented us. They beg for us, they're begging for us still. So I say, we stand tall and proud, brother. Bills come due. Let's not hide here in the basement like you've got something to be ashamed of. No, not us. You and me against the world. Don't care if it's death herself. She wants Madeline. Fucking Usher. She's gonna have to look me straight in the eyes.
From the most recent Mike Flanagan creation, The Fall of the House of Usher. The scene has Madeline and Roderick Usher, the sibling pharma tyrants, going on a tirade about society before they pay their overdue check to the devil. Although she is more like the Persian Satana Jason Georgiani speaks about. As Radiohead wrote in Karma Police, this is what you get.
You can't play God without being acquainted with the devil.
But Madeline Usher is not wrong. We do give power to the Argons and their Karens and Catamites in the establishment. Nobody holds a gun or Viagra hard penis to our heads when we go for the fentanyl or the OnlyFans or the two-party system or the bad diet or the doom scrolling or the Netflix binge watching or whatever. Nobody told us to cram a handful of blue pills up our rectums of reality. But hey, why do shadow work when we can enjoy the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave? Why take the inner journey when we can fly to Cancun and take pictures of our food for Insta? Why stand for wisdom when we can stand for the next thing we're told is the next big thing?
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Yes, we are trapped. But in this cosmic Shawshank, we are often fooled to double as the prison guards. As Dostoevsky wrote, the best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in a prison. But as Philip K. Dick wrote in The Divine Invasion, what a tragic world this is. Those down here are prisoners. And the ultimate tragedy is that they don't know it. They think they are free because they've never been free and do not understand what it means. This is a prison and few men have guessed. But I know that is why I am here. To burn the walls, to tear down the metal gates, to break each chain.
I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
So it's our fault too, and our responsibility. But you of the broken places know that already, ye high priests and priestesses of Hermes the god of thieves and Sophia the goddess of smugglers. You know your role and are out of the game of Saturn, have decided against a lead role in a cage and would rather go for a walk-on part in the war, as Pink Floyd sang in Wish You Were Here. You've put down the Big Mac and grabbed the Philosopher's Stone, and you're finally ready not to be the change you want to see in the world, as Gandhi said, but the strange you want to see in the world. To be a living glitch in the Matrix, spraying graffiti on Plato's cave's walls and shattering those mind-forged manacles William Blake spoke about.
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Aeon by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week I, your host, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring you the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird. This is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. And you deserve to be here, for you are a shining, crazy diamond that should be seen and can ignite the universe with so much wonder.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon?
Then you'll see that it is not the spoon that bends. It is only yourself.
So how do we get out of this prison, this digital hellscape and bad software simulation? Well, I can assure you the Gnosis and Technosis of our Astral Guest will come a long way. A massive red pill suppository. It's an honor to have David Sweeney back at the virtual Alexandria. He will be discussing, yes, getting out of the digital hellscapes and bad software simulation. From Philip K. Dick to Grant Morrison. From Baudrillard to the recent Apple show Silo. From postmodernism to anarchism. Get ready finally to awaken to your destined potential.
It's become appallingly clear that our technology has surpassed our humanity.
And you know, David, we'll discuss so much Gnosticism in modern times, as well as a lot of cool conspiracy stuffy stuff.
I turned myself into a pickle and 9/11 was an inside job? Was it? Who cares, Morty? Global acts of terrorism happen every day. Here's something that's never happened before. I'm a pickle!
You'll end up understanding this passage from Philip K. Dick, I assure you. It goes, my big question remains, how faked is our own phenomenal world? At one end, the answer could be, it is a partially viewed reality. At the other end, it is a total hypnotic delusion. But that black iron prison, that is real. I used to be in that prison.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you.
You're locked in here with me!
Not anymore, we of the broken places. For wokesters or NPCs that might be listening, let me share a story I heard from one of my favorite esotericists, Benebel Wen, on her YouTube channel. She talked about her days practicing Buddhism. One time, Benebel told her master that she thought Siddhartha wasn't that great of an example. After all, he abandoned his family to go to some metaphysical man cave. His temptations of Mara were mostly about hot chicks. So he was basically a projecting incel. He took his time in all things and wasn't mature in many cases before reaching enlightenment.
You have to joyfully participate in the suffering of the world.
Benebel's master agreed that Siddhartha wasn't a good role model, that he was deficient. Then he told Benebel that since she was ahead of Siddhartha in awareness and integrity, it would be a lot easier for her to reach enlightenment. And good luck with that.
Shut up!
So I say the same to you, wokesters and NPCs. If you think, for example, that the founding fathers were lacking in character and morality, then it shouldn't be a problem for you to defeat any mighty empire and start your own country. Shouldn't take you long. And this new country of yours will be much better than the USA or any Western country. Good luck with that. I'm sure you'll also do better than Jesus and not get caught or lose your temper. You'll do much better than Crowley, Bowie, Joseph Smith, Muhammad, or Mary Magdalene. You've got this, and good luck with that.
Shut up!
This is what you get. This is what you get.
And a dishonest man you can always trust to be dishonest. Honestly. It's the honest ones you want to watch out for. Because you can never predict when they're going to do something incredibly stupid.
You just don't get it, do you? We liked historical figures or impactful celebrities, not because we knew them, but because they helped us know ourselves. This is what you get. We are all in the gutter, as Oscar Wilde said, but some of us are looking at stars. In our imperfections and sins, whether we're eating Big Macs or have the Philosopher's Stone, we can help each other escape this black iron prison. That is the mission of Aeon Byte. That is what your fallen host, Miguel Connor, has always tried to do. Welcome to the desert of the real. This is what you get. On to the interview with David Sweeney. But first, how about some more Gnosis from The Fall of the House of Usher?
Life hands you lemons.
Make lemonade.
First, you roll out a multimedia campaign to convince people lemons are incredibly scarce, which only works if you stockpile lemons, control the supply, then a media blitz. Lemons are the only way to say I love you, the must-have accessory for engagements or anniversaries. Roses are out, lemons are in, billboards that say she won't have sex with you unless you've got lemons. You cut the beers in on it. Limited edition lemon bracelets, yellow diamonds called lemon drops. You get Apple to call their new operating system OS Lemon. Little accent over the O. You charge 40% more for organic lemons, 50% more for conflict-free lemons. You pack the capital with lemon lobbyists. You get a Kardashian to suck a lemon wedge in a leaked sex tape. Timothy Chalamet wears lemon shoes at Cannes. Get a hashtag campaign. Something isn't cool or tight or awesome. No, it's lemon. Did you see that movie? Did you go to that concert? It was effing lemon. Billie Eilish, OMG, hashtag lemon. You get Dr. Oz to recommend 4 lemons a day and a lemon suppository supplement to get rid of toxins, because there is nothing scarier than toxins. Then you patent the seeds. You write a line of genetic code that makes lemons look just a little more like tits, and you get a gene patent for the tit lemon DNA sequence. You cross-pollinate, you get those seeds circulating in the wild, and then you sue the farmers for copyright infringement when that genetic code shows up on their land. Sit back, rake in the millions, and then, when you're done, and you've sold your lempire for a few $1 billion, then, and only then, you make some fucking lemonade.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined back again by David Sweeney. This time he will be discussing, or we'll all be covering, a sundry of amazing topics, but we will be focusing on his book, Scanned Clean, rereading Michael Marshall Smith in the Digital Age. David, thank you very much for coming back on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's almost a pleasure, a privilege.
And it's always a lot of fun and very insightful. And with us, too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine this wonderful California morning. Looking forward to hearing about this author and the digital analysis of literature.
So, David, it seems the world is just getting crazier since we last talked. What do you think?
Oh, I mean, it's just one thing after another, isn't it? It's just, I watched the second season of White Lotus earlier this year.
Show.
Yeah, and you've got the young woman in it who Haley Lou Richardson, I think, played her, and she's saying, all I do is just sit and doom scroll all day, and I found myself doing that. I really had to stop, just try to stay away from it. But at the same time, you're thinking, oh my God, I've got to know what's going on. So, yeah, it's unprecedented, I think.
Oh, it is. It's the collapse of Western man's psyche, and yeah, you're right, because if I look outside at nature, everything's fine. Nobody cares. But with the news and social media, but at the same time, you are a scholar. We like to try to be as much as anthropologists as possible. In other words, go in and neutrally see things. But yeah, it can be confounding. It can be very confounding and definitely depressing, because people are suffering, their psyches are under a lot of strain, and you wish they would feel better, right?
Well, I was speaking to my students yesterday on my moving image course, and I was really surprised and kind of heartened to hear that so many of them have just withdrawn from social media, for that kind of doom scrolling idea that they just can't take it anymore. And they were telling me about how much they've really enjoyed kind of going outside. And, Glasgow's such a beautiful city. It's the dear green place. And, a lot of them are saying that that social media is sort of something that you kind of grow out of, it's really essentially the teenage experience, or central to the teenage experience rather. But then as you mature, it's something you kind of step away from. So I was really glad to hear that, because when social media is just intensifies things that are already unbearably intense, So I'm definitely staying away from that. But even just watching the mainstream media, and there's so much going on over here. There's so many different scandals related to media and to celebrity and so on. And there's that, and then there's obviously the geopolitical situation. But there's just constant sort of sense that the weight of all this information coming in is just not good for you. That we're not kind of built to be this aware, I think. So, stepping back.
Good point. Yeah, because on the one hand, you're like, well, social media is just atomizing our minds, but God forbid we go back to the times of legacy media when it's just one big propaganda machine. It's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, well, it's good that, people are, students and just people generally are critical of legacy and mainstream media, that they've learned how to read it, that they don't just accept everything it says, So otherwise it just does become, as you say, propaganda. And so I'm kind of really heartened by that as well, that the students are not, the thing that I'm glad that as well that they've avoided is cynicism. Instead they're healthily skeptical, because I think cynicism is the soul killer. That's when you die inside, when you become cynical.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You've got to keep your soul healthy. And yeah, I think, do you, for example, try to teach your students about things like synchromysticism or Jungian view of symbols and all that? Sort of teach them like, this is still, in a way, it's a construct, and the machine is alive. There's always a rhythm and a cadence and a bunch of symbols and two groups that are pitted against each other. There's a narrative that if you look at it, you go like, hey, this is a story and maybe I can not belong to the story or just write another story.
It's less that I teach them that because, I work at an art school, so we're there as the kind of contextual studies department. And the majority of the students' time is spent in the studio. But when they come to us in their final year, they have an open subject choice. They can write an essay or a dissertation about anything. And you do find students have got an interest in things like symbolic analysis, comparative mythology. They become very interested in media theory, and I see synchromysticism as a kind of extension of media theory.
Right.
So I had a great student a few years ago who, independent of me, had discovered synchromysticism, a fine art student, and had become really immersed in it and was making work kind of influenced by it. I'm missing the person's name. Was it Jake Ketz, who was the Canadian synchromystic?
I'm
probably
not sure.
mispronouncing his name. It was my student was very influenced by him, and made really interesting kind of media collages, inspired by particularly the one that Jake, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the surname, that Jake made about the actress Robin Tunney, who he saw as a kind of high priestess of the apocalypse. She was in a movie called something like K2. Yeah, the Mountain K2,
right,
which he then inverted to be 2K as in Y2K, and then looked at all the other movies that she was in. She was in some like other apocalypse movie, and she was in Empire Records, where she had a kind of symbolic death and rebirth and things. It was totally fascinating. So yeah, the students, they kind of find that on their own, and then we, kind of cultivate their interest in it, rather than it being sort of core to the curriculum. But I do have a lot of students that are interested in Jungian theories and analysis. Actually, germane to what we're going to speak about today, not Michael Marshall Smith himself, but Jean Baudrillard. There's a real resurgence of interest in Baudrillard's philosophy, particularly his ideas about simulation, and media theory. Because he famously said that the Gulf War didn't happen, and he infamously said that 9/11 didn't happen. So, and what he meant was that, it was deliberately provocative, but it was there to kind of say, well, how do you know it happened? You only know, as you said, the kind of narrative that you were given. So I find a lot of students are very interested in that again, and I think that is a result of media saturation. I've got a lot of students talking to me in tutorials about authenticity, kind of longing for the real, which is, as Baudrillard said, you can forget the real, it's gone, but,
it's done.
Maybe we can get it back, I don't know.
Oh yeah, it is incredible. Like you said, all this information is, it's interactive, but yeah, reality is, completely collapsed, especially when you look at people, how they will look at an issue or an event and they will see completely different things. And if you don't still yourself, you might get swept away. But if you're in your center, you're like, okay, I don't know if the event no longer matters. It's almost like the reaction of all these sides and the narratives they take and the symbols they circle their wagons around. It's, yeah, like you said, for Baudrillard or Philip K. Dick or Carl Jung or even Marshall McLuhan, I'd say watch these guys, think about projection, reality, and then, be, as I tell people, stay stoic, my friend, and just be an anthropologist. Just walk through the jungle and take notes and find out more about yourself than anything, what your role might be in this world. Everybody has a role and a mission and can be helpful.
What I'm really glad to see kind of diminishing in terms of like student interest is this idea of post-truth, that was really prevalent after Trump got elected, but also kind of corresponding with that was this idea that you create your own reality. And I've never been comfortable with that idea, that there is a reality that we all share, and we have to accept that there's a reality we all share. So there's a great American academic, a living academic, called Jodi Dean, and she wrote a really influential essay about how The internet has been presented to as a common sphere, a kind of public sphere, but it's highly regulated. And that, this was back in like 2006 that Jodie wrote that essay. And in it, she said, one of the most pernicious ideas associated with the internet is that it's full of multiple realities. There is only one reality, and it is a site of conflict. And it's true, So, it seems to me like a kind of consumer mentality to think that you just pick and choose reality, or you just pick and choose truth. And we have to kind of, I think, realize that we do share a planet, and we do share these events happen, and then there is a narrative that surrounds the event that has happened, and we have to understand how those narratives are generated.
Yeah, it's quite a battle, and even then we can go into the Jungian part, or where his famous dictum, if you don't make the conscious, it will appear as fate. It appears we have no free will. In fact, there are so many studies I've been researching where, people they put things on their mind, EKGs or whatever I'm calling, and they find out that decisions are made before somebody's conscious. And so many other studies where we make decisions way before we think we make them because of all the programming, our past, our complexes, all that. So there's that too, right, David? There's what I tell people. Yeah, you got to untangle this sort of a weird reality, matrix reality, but you also have to understand your inner matrix, which is kind of the same. It's a big domain of layers of false information or coded information.
Yeah, I mean, another contemporary American academic, Stephen Shaviro, who wrote a book called Doom Patrols in the 90s, which was inspired by Grant Morrison's run on the comic Doom Patrol. Stephen Shaviro writes a lot about that idea that, the same kind of thing you're talking about, that research into decision-making, that decisions are made before the kind of conscious recognition that the decision has been made. And, and actually Michael Marshall Smith has written about that in some of his work. He talks about the kind of reptilian back brain makes, a decision which you then articulate, and that's something that I think the students are interested in as well. There's a kind of return of a lot of the kind of theory that was floating about in the 90s and early 2000s, which is when I was sort of cutting my teeth in all this stuff. And there's definitely a return of interest in that. But there's a lot of really interesting theory going on at the moment as well about, ideas of the physicality of the internet. The server farms that power the internet. How they're affecting the environment. These things are quite often put into water. In coastal areas, and because they're so hot, they begin to have an effect on those environments. And then you think about, the physicality of the internet in terms of people's bodies. I'm sure you've seen those things in like New Scientist where they kind of try and predict or project what humans are going to look like. And quite often you look like a grey alien, like with big eyes and long fingers, because. Yeah. So I think people have become very conscious of that, that's related to things like doom scrolling as well. I mean, doom scrolling has that mental effect, but depression is always a very physical illness as well. So I think that's good. I mean, there's the phrase post-internet. It's been bandied around quite a lot on the internet. So you kind of think, how post-internet can it actually be? But I think there is a sort of sense that the internet has lost its novelty in a lot of ways. And in that sense, people are now looking for something not, against the internet, but something other, or something, that you can do rather than spending all your time online. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the kind of authentic experience that people seem to be craving. And part of that, I think, too, relates to the lockdown during the pandemic. There is the kind of cliche that people just spent their whole lives online. But that's not necessarily true, because people had more time to go and wander around the streets. The streets were empty. Go and wander around parks and things like that. Social distance though you might have been. And you also had people doing things that they didn't have time to do before, like, gardening. Even if it was just gardening, in a balcony, if you lived in like a flat or an apartment, growing your own food, learning how to bake is a big thing in Britain, all this sort of stuff. And I've also got a lot of students tell me that they've got really into traditional crafts recently. Like knitting. Knitting's a big one at the moment, very fashionable. And the kind of satisfaction that comes from making something. The kind of tactility of the process, and then the fact that you've actually done something productive rather than doom scroll.
Yeah, that's good news indeed. And yes, I sometimes miss late spring, early summer of 2020 because it was nice where I could drive. There was no traffic. Go to the store. There was nobody there. I could walk parks and dog parks and let my dogs out and just walk. And there was nothing there, nobody around. It was wonderful to move and walk around and just sort of take life. Yeah, and gas was really cheap too. I remember gas prices just collapsing.
That's right.
I'm going to drive around. There's no traffic. There's no people. I'm just going to drive in and listen to the Beatles or something. It was awesome. And Vance, well, let's bring you in. What do you think about what we're talking about? Are we in digital hell, or what says thou?
Well, it goes back to free will as far as doom scrolling goes. I've noticed that. I'm a Facebook user, but I tend to try to filter out all the garbage things, although some of it leaks in. But which comes back to free will. And what about the concept of we program ourselves, and then later on we may react before our consciousness decides to think about it, but that reaction is actually a function, not entirely, but a lot of how we've programmed ourselves before, our attitudes. So now maybe you could argue that, well, our attitudes were pre-programmed, but in that case, then free will, of course, collapses, and then we don't have a choice but to doom scroll, right?
Yeah, it's pretty entangling sometimes.
Yeah. And no, I for one, I know the concept of walking nature, gardening, growing your own food, going back to nature, traditional crafts and so forth, music. Oh, there you go. Here's a knee-jerk reaction. That's not my free will. I'm a musician, and in my younger days, I used to play in bands and play out at weddings and parties and so forth, and I used to love it. But as time went on, the media, namely disc jockeys and CDs and all the music that's available on the internet, has pushed live music out so that the number of live bands that are in demand is like dwindling almost to nothing.
Oh wow.
And so my opportunities for playing with other people out in public have grown smaller year after year. So there's an argument for saying, that our technology is robbing us of our human interaction with each other.
That's really interesting, because there seemed to be, and seems to certainly in Britain, a kind of resurgence in live music. That not just kind of big mega concerts like Taylor Swift or something like this, but small club bands playing. There's a very healthy music scene in Glasgow and always has been,
Cool.
So I think, but one of the things that I've been talking about with my moving image students recently is, it's not new, but it's something that, I think is significant is, people going to a gig, a performance by a band or a comedian and filming it so that they're not really in the moment. They're standing there with their phone, that kind of thing. And then archiving it. You had the kind of phenomenon, like when Chris Rock played in Glasgow, I think it was part of this tour they did. One of the conditions for the audience was that they had to surrender their phones, which were locked in, kind of little yellow bag with a name on it, but they weren't allowed to have their phone for the duration of the performance. I think Kanye West did it as well. And there's this weird phenomenon that there's been recently, like this year, which is sort of extension of that, of people throwing phones at performers.
Really?
There was like some pop star got hit in the face with a phone.
Oh dear.
And actually, that is now kind of mutated into a sort of general trend of just throwing things at performers. And not in a kind of appreciative way, sort of like, bunches of flowers, but, coins and other kind of heavy, sharp objects. So, the live experience of music is something that I really loved and treasured when I was younger, but I can't remember the last time that I went to see a band. I think I've just kind of aged out of it, I think.
How about at weddings and so forth? Like here in the States, my impression is, I haven't gone to a lot lately, but if you have a wedding, it's always got to be a DJ. It's got to be a DJ. And DJs are putting themselves forward as if they're musicians. Oh, yes, because I know how to mix this song and that song, and maybe I'm sounding like an old man. But to me, that used to be a joke. What instrument do you play? The record player, right? Now it's a reality. But in Great Britain, is it the same over there? Are people, when they have weddings, are having DJs instead of bands?
Well, I think the kind of usual thing is to have a DJ, and if you can afford one, to have, a name DJ rather than a kind of journeyman DJ who just plays that circuit. My father was a musician who played regularly on the kind of wedding circuit. A very accomplished, very sort of technically gifted musician, but didn't play any kind of original material or ever write any original material. Right. And I think there is still an interest in having that. But yeah, I think the default tends to be more like having a DJ there. And, full disclosure, in the 90s and early 2000s, I was a DJ, like a hip hop DJ, who scratched records and mixed them and all that, But I'm also a trained musician, so, and I did see it as a kind of extension. I don't know if I ever thought about it quite as an instrument as much, because what was more important, I think, was about the way that records were put together. I do think that there is a skill to that, if not an art.
I agree. Yeah, I do agree.
But what you also get a lot now is, I find this quite fascinating, is, that DJs don't use records anymore. It's all digital. Right. And you can get like a virtual record. So rather than carrying around, like I do, which I've got such a bad back, but carrying around boxes of vinyl, you'll see like DJs, even kind of hip hop turntablists, will turn up for gigs with two like virtual records. Well, they're actual physical artifacts, and you put them onto a kind of digital turntable, and you can manipulate them. They look like 12-inch records, and you manipulate them in the way that you would a vinyl record, so you can scratch and cut and all that kind of thing. But what you're scratching and cutting is an MP3, is a digital track. So that's the way that technology has developed.
That's funny.
But sometimes DJs do just bring MP3s along and plug them into a laptop, and that's it, which I personally find a bit underwhelming. I like to see somebody carrying a box of records. Maybe because
I remember the old days. And what about here in the United States when there's a big brawl? There's a term, it's called an Irish wedding. Are the Scots the same? Is it just, why have a DJ? Everybody's going to start hitting each other after a while. Are you more civilized?
Well, I'm an Irish citizen, so
okay.
Irish weddings, I think that's the old Irish wedding.
Right.
And so Scottish, Scottish weddings, the few that I haven't been to that many Scottish weddings, but I do remember what the kind of highlight of a Scottish wedding was, probably just before the brawl that you talk about, was when, a kind of drunken patriarch or, somebody like that would go up and sing something really sentimental, to his wife, and it would be like in a kind of unintentionally they would sound like Captain Beefheart or something like that, So that was what I always liked about weddings, when people would get all kind of sort of misty eyed as somebody would be singing maybe an old Irish folk song or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's the same, David, right? The humans go to a wedding, but you got the same thing. You've got underlying resentments, trauma, complexes, ancestral issues, family friction, and before, you let the inhibition out and it all comes out. Not that different than social media. Same same as it ever was. And I think for free will, it's I go back to Neo in the Matrix when the Oracle tells him it's not about making the choice, it's about understanding why you make the choice. Don't worry about the free will, worry about the self-reflection. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I wonder if you can sort of extend the kind of musical analogy a little bit,
Sure.
like thinking about improvisation within a structure. You have, like, say, somebody like John Coltrane, and his groups would play maybe like, a kind of classic, even something like Greensleeves, but improvise within the structure. Miles Davis, taking like a pop song or a kind of romantic ballad and improvising within that. And maybe that's what we all do, within socially constructed structures, or, whatever the programming, as you were saying, Vance, we improvise within that. And that's the kind of sense of agency that we all have. But then there's sometimes where you think, am I really making a choice? I was trying to explain to students recently the difference between the concept of affect and emotion. And, the best way, and this probably is what you would expect from an Irish Scots person, I said, well, think about affect as a hangover, right? When you've got a hangover, and it's been a long time since I've had a hangover. You try and understand it. Your body is poisoned and polluted, and it hates you for that while, and it makes you very emotional. And your emotional response to your hangover is a way to kind of try and make sense of it. So affect, I think, is like, your general sense of being in the world. Your understanding, your awareness of the kind of social pressures and tensions that there are. And sometimes your emotional response, which is very kind of subjective and personalized, is, I think, a way to try and understand affect. I don't think I explained that very well there or to the students, but yeah, that's something that I find myself thinking.
Sounds like the difference between an ache and a pain.
yeah, no, that's much better, Vance. Yeah, I think I'll steal that from.
Sure. Ouch.
Copyright the Moondog. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, why don't we talk about your book? Vance and I are not that familiar with Michael Marshall Smith, so tell us about his work and why it's important as we try to decipher these digital hellscapes of today.
Yeah, well, I can lead into this, if it's okay, Miguel, by just sort of talking a bit about Silo.
Sure.
Or do you want to do it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we can start with Silo. I would love to lead in with Silo. Sure.
Okay, well, I'd emailed you after I'd watched the first season of Silo, and I was really taken with it. For listeners that might not know, Silo is a TV series on Apple TV. It's just one season so far. I think the second season's been greenlit, and it's based on a series of sort of dystopian science fiction books by a writer called Hugh Howey, who initially self-published them through Amazon's Kindle apparatus, but has subsequently licensed some, and he's made a fortune out of them. So kudos to him for being the kind of self-publishing success he is. So I think this series of books is called Wool, and the significance of that is that the world of Silo, it's post-apocalyptic Earth sometime in the far future, where the surface is uninhabitable. So human beings live in these huge silos that have been there for a long time, that are these kind of, kind of deep cities, I guess, that are all these layered cities that go deep, deep down into the earth. They've got all these kind of agreements that are there to kind of keep the social contract going. And you can see on one floor, you can see the outside world through a kind of video screen. And if you suddenly decide, or if you decide over a period of time that you want to go outside, that you don't want to live in the silo, even though you've been told that it's uninhabitable, you have to be allowed to go outside. So, you put on this kind of like spacesuit type thing, and you walk to the hangar door and you go through this kind of decompression, you get sprayed with some sort of agent, whatever it is, and you go outside, and usually what happens, you're given a piece of wool to take with you, a cloth. And when you're outside, you see what reality is. And most people, in fact, almost everyone who goes outside, then turns around and starts to clean the sensors, the cameras for the video screens, because they realize that the outside world is as bad as they've been told it is. Okay, and then they walk up a hill and then they die, right? From radiation poisoning, apparently.
Right.
So but then there's this recurring kind of heresy, that the inhabitants of the silo are being lied to, and that the outside world isn't uninhabitable, or at least it isn't uninhabitable anymore. So why are they not allowed to go outside? And when I watched that, and I'm sure you're both thinking this as well, this is very like Philip K. Dick's novel, The Penultimate Truth.
Right, yeah.
From 1964, in which there has been a nuclear war. The surface of the Earth has been made uninhabitable for a period, and human beings live underground in what in the novel are called ant tanks. So, there's the kind of mass concentration of people who labor away in these underground dwelling places. But the reality is that the surface is perfectly safe. It's regenerated itself. So there's an elite that lives on the surface in these vast domains, as they're called in the book, these huge villas that people have got with huge estates. And they are these greedy elites, who want to keep the surface for themselves, but they've got an underground proletariat who labor for them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first thing that I thought of when I watched Silo. I was also reminded a bit of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, when the people who do go outside walk up the hill and die. It's a bit like the Mercer box in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and people kind of watch them and watch them and experience a sort of catharsis in the kind of Greek sense of it. You get very upset, but it also affirms the social order. The belief that it's necessary for people to live underground, and the kind of stratification of the silos, comparable to a kind of social class system. The kind of thing that you would see in like Snowpiercer, if you've seen that, the different, the different kind of the classes of the train, that sort of thing.
Yeah, horizontal instead of vertical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
By the way, this sounds like A Boy and His Dog. You remember that old movie?
Oh yeah,
wow.
Yeah. Don Johnson. Yeah. That's a blast from the past. Yeah. No pun intended. So you've got the kind of heresy, and that narrative runs through it. That there's inconsistencies in the story, and at one point there's a kind of glitch, and the kind of video screen image of this blasted heath outside is replaced with an image of a perfectly habitable meadow. I'm trying not to spoil it for the listeners, because I would encourage people to watch it. It's very entertaining. It's very well made. It stars Rebecca Ferguson, who is a great actress. And,
she's brilliant and nice on the eye. She's like the full package.
Yeah,
she can even sing.
Oh yeah, and she's what, Swedish, so she's got quite often in movies, she's got an American accent on.
Right.
But in Silo, you can hear a Swedish accent coming through, and she actually sounds Irish, which makes it even more perfect. So you've got that kind of aspect of it. Is she something that we'd emailed about, Miguel, about the emphasis in it on she becomes a police officer, like the kind of chief of police, right? But before that, she's an engineer, and the narrative is a detective story.
Right, yeah.
She investigates these deaths, and also the, what's going on outside, and corruption amongst the kind of elites and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, that was my complaint, but I was also, it was a surrendering complaint, as we've talked, because yes, there's so much of the story, it's her playing detective, but I was like, I want to get more into the philosophy, like Snowpiercer does and other Gnostic movies do, instead of, but then I was like resigned, because as we've talked, there's something about, it's almost when you have a Gnostic story, you're going to have to inject either a Western or noir detective, right? Like 13th Floor, Dark City, Blade Runner. There's sort of hard boil. I got to solve a crime. I don't trust the dame. I don't know who I am. Is my boss going to betray me? You know, this very modern Gnostic vibe, and Silo does just that. It's got everything.
Yeah, and you had that in the OA as well that I've spoken to on your show. But the one thing that reminded me of was there's a great, it's called a postmodern detective novel, but I would say it's more kind of just an existentialist detective novel called The New York Trilogy by Paul Auster that came out in the mid-'80s. Paul Auster's a New York writer. And the structure of it is based on the Beckett trilogy. You know, the three novellas by Beckett. So the idea is that the narrator in the second novel is revealed to be the author of the first novella. Then the person in the third is revealed to be the author of the second one, and therefore that means they're the author of the first one. And then, you know, the implication is, well, if Beckett is the author of all three, then who is the author of Beckett? You know, It's that kind of idea of the kind of recursive notion of, you know, who made who, as AC/DC once put it, you know.
I think Mike Flanagan does it with his new series The Fall of the House of Usher, where everything is just part of an Edgar Allan Poe plot, and you know what's going to happen, but you wonder if the characters are talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and you're like, don't you know you're in his story? Get out. It's kind of that kind of same vibe.
Well, Paul Auster did that in this novel, and you know, I used to teach comparative literature at the University of Glasgow before I moved to the art school to teach, and we taught that novel, the New York Trilogy, there, and we compared it to Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and you know, the sense that Sophocles goes and investigates this mystery, you know, and you know who's the killer, and he is revealed to be the killer, you know. So you know, it's that kind of, you know, as you were saying,
like Mickey Rourke and Angel Heart.
Angel Heart, yeah. You mentioned Blade Runner, Deckard, you know,
right.
Who is he really? That sort of thing. So I think the existential aspect of it worked quite well, and of the existential aspect of the detective story worked well in the OA. You know, where you've got the character Kareem Washington in the second season, and of course that ends with him having this literally awe-inspiring revelation that he's a fictional character. You know, spoilers, but that he's a fictional character, right? And it's interesting to me that Britt Marlin and Zal Batmanglij, who made the OA, you know, their new thing that comes out next month is called A Murder at the End of the World.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of post-Knives Out type whodunit. But of course, they just use those kind of genre trappings for all their kind of philosophical and indeed Gnostic explorations. So I agree with you that I would like to have seen more of that in Silo, and hopefully it's going to lead into that. But even, you know, the kind of look and feel of it, all these journeys that people have to make between floors, because there's no elevators. And, you know, that's one of the plot points. Why aren't there elevators in this place, you know? And it's kind of, you know, a heresy to complain for the lack of elevators. You know, so that it feels very kind of like a pilgrimage, you know, when people have to go down all these different levels, and there's the porters who run about, you know, these who are kind of literally hermetic, you know, they're like Hermes, you know, the messenger. And there's all that kind of, so it felt very, not labyrinthine, I guess. Is it Pirandelli? Is that the artist I'm thinking of? And maybe a bit like Escher as well. And you could also think in the myth of Sisyphus, you know, you're constantly, you know, repeating the same things, going, you know, rolling the stone and all this kind of thing. But I found Silo also to be very reminiscent of one of Michael Marshall Smith's novels. His first novel, in fact, Only Forward. So that came out in 1994. And Michael Marshall Smith is a British science fiction and horror and crime writer who I discovered in the 90s with his second novel, Spares. And Spares was optioned by DreamWorks, but they made the film The Island instead, which is very similar to spares. You know, the idea that you can grow clones for spare parts. That's why it's called spare. The movie and the novel Never Let Me Go.
No, yeah, that was intense.
Yeah, so that's very like spares as well. But in one of us is a really strange novel. Not One of Us, sorry, that's his third novel. Only Forward is a really strange novel in that. So Michael was a very early internet adopter, and I wouldn't say that his writing is cyberpunk at all. But Only Forward comes close to being like cyberpunk. So the setting for that is this future city that's just called The City, which is broken up into neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods are themed. So, you know, you get a neighborhood called Color, which is for people who like colors. You've got a neighborhood called the Cat District, which is run by cats and all this sort of thing. And it seemed to me that it was very like in a kind of imagining of the internet. You know, that the websites that you have correspond to your personal inclinations and tastes and dispositions. But one of the neighborhoods and again, it's a detective story, so that, you know, the character Hap is employed to go and investigate things by the people who rule the city. So in this case, it's a missing person. One of the neighborhoods that he goes to that he has to break into, most of all the other neighborhoods, you're allowed free passage. You might have to, like, you know, get your papers checked at the border or something, but most places you can go as you wish, right? Apart from this one neighborhood called Stable. And Stable is like the conceit behind Penultimate Truth and Silo. And well, we don't actually know what the truth is in Silo at the end of the first season. We don't know if the outside world definitely is uninhabitable or not, right? But in Only Forward, Stable is this recreation of a sort of perfect idea of like 1950s America. And the people in Stable live in a kind of collective fiction, right? You know, they believe that the outside world is uninhabitable apart from Stable. And in that environment, it's like this kind of, you know, mid-century, mid-20th century, kind of very relaxed, conservative in a lot of ways, in neighborhood where there are things like crime and all that, but mostly it's just a very kind of pleasant way to live your life. You know,
right.
You just kind of got on with it. But the people who run Stable have told them that the outside world is not, you know, it's not safe to go into. So that it's only part of the novel, but I know that Mike, having interviewed him and done various sort of events with him and things, I know that he is influenced by Philip K. Dick, and he did win the Philip K. Dick Awards a few times for his writing.
Oh, wow.
So in his third novel, which is sort of themed around alien abductions, you've got the third novel's called One of Us. You've got the kind of, again, sort of detective type, or at least investigative type, central character and narrator, who lives in near future LA and lives in a neighborhood called Griffith Park, which has been turned into a very much sort of late capitalist environment, which people have protested about. So there's a kind of simulation of old Griffith Park, which is projected onto the walls around Griffith Park, so that people object to the new Griffith Park don't have to look at it. They look at a simulation of the old Griffith Park. And the influence that's there on Michael is Jean Baudrillard, of whom he's a huge fan. And you can see the influence of Baudrillard throughout Michael Marshall Smith's work. And Baudrillard, of course, you know, was a big influence on The Matrix. Although he felt that his book, Simulation Simulacra, is in The Matrix. It's taken off the shelf by Neo at one point. But he felt that the Wachowskis had completely misunderstood his ideas. You know, because he said that there is no separation anymore between the simulation and reality. The simulation is reality, reality is a simulation. And the first, sort of examples that he gave for that. So he was a French philosopher who was fascinated by America. And I mentioned Stephen Shaviro earlier on. Stephen Shaviro was very critical of Baudrillard because he felt Baudrillard was in the tradition of these kind of gloomy European intellectuals who go to America and go, nobody realizes that this is all fake. It's not real. Like Theodor Adorno had done, in the 40s and 50s when he talked about the culture industry and how everything was unreal. And Shaviro says, no, everybody in America knows that it's not, but that is their reality, that it's not real. So, Baudrillard would talk a lot about Disneyland and how Disneyland was was necessary to the American experience for people to kind of be able to live in such a kind of inauthentic, fake culture. And Shaviro's response is like, nobody in America is fooled by Disneyland. Everybody knows that it's, it's a construct, it's a creation, all this sort of stuff. So, Shaviro, when Baudrillard died, Shaviro wrote quite a respectful but critical obituary of him, and Michael Marshall Smith wrote a very respectful obituary of him too. But Baudrillard's ideas are very McLuhan influenced, I think, but they're also very similar to the ideas of Guy Debord from the Situationists, who your recent guest was talking about on the episode about American Gnosis. If you remind me of his name, I just forgot.
Yeah, Arthur Versluis.
Yeah. So his, I thought that was a really fascinating episode where he was talking about, the way that so many things are called Gnosis quite lazily. Some people, and he mentioned the Situationists, and he mentioned Marx. I wouldn't describe either Marx or Guy Debord and the Situationists. So Guy Debord was one of the founding members of the Situationists and probably the best known, particularly for his book, The Society of the Spectacle, which kind of deals with, understands capitalism as one big spectacle, not just in terms of things like, advertising, moving images and all that kind of thing, but just the whole thing is a spectacle. Mm-hmm. What influenced Guy Debord there was Marx, and Marx's particular idea of false consciousness. For Marx, what capitalism was a sort of paradigm shift in the way that people experienced the world, but it was false, right? Their understanding of the world was false. So related to the concept of false consciousness in Marxist theory is another concept of his of commodity fetishism. And what Marx was saying was that commodities, and this is a sort of rough quote from Marx, but he says, when we first look at a commodity, it just seems like any other thing. But actually, when we think about it, now Marx says something like it's full of, theological niceties and complexities, something like that. But why is that? Well, it's because of the way that, on one hand, capitalism brings unprecedented abundance into the world. And, if you think about Marx as a 19th century writer, he's writing he's a German living in London, but he's writing as the Industrial Revolution is unfolding before him. And you're seeing, the transformation of cities like London and Paris into these metropoles, with the unprecedented amounts of people being brought into the cities. The people from what would have been, the rural peasantry are brought in to become the new urban proletariat. Mm-hmm. And you've, international trade on an unprecedented scale. The sheer productive power of the Industrial Revolution, which Marx was impressed by. I mean, this is something that people forget. Marx didn't think that the Industrial Revolution was necessarily bad. He just felt that it was in the hands of the wrong people. Right. So much so that, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels speculate that, as they say, that the industrialists, the capitalists, bourgeoisie, as they called them, have created their own gravediggers. Now, why? Because capitalism is so fundamentally exploitative and iniquitous, that what that is done, they say in the Communist Manifesto, is lay bare all the kind of deceptions of history. Because, of course, as everybody knows from the Communist Manifesto, the history of all society is the history of class struggle, which is what, they say in the Communist Manifesto. So now there's no kind of like religion to distract you. There's no kind of sort of feudal or filial thing to distract you. It's just sheer naked exploitation. And again, to quote from the Communist Manifesto, they say all that is solid is melted into air, and they see that as a revolutionary moment. Of course, it doesn't happen. You have the Soviet Revolution. You've failed revolutions around the world. One of the reasons it doesn't happen is because of the stuff that is produced under capitalism. All these wonderful things that, if you read contemporary writing about, from the 19th century about the first department stores in Paris, for example, you've got people being overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of goods that are available. Nobody's ever seen it like that before. Like the ordinary person on the street just going into a department store and being overwhelmed by that abundance. Émile Zola, the great French novelist, wrote about that. So Marx kind of develops his ideas into this notion of false consciousness, that you become so sort of enchanted by capitalism, its productive power, and by the way that capitalism seems to be without any of the the kind of trappings of previous social movements, that previous kind of forms, economic systems. It seems to be purely about this notion of human nature and what human beings want, and it seems to give so much to people. And of course, we know capitalism doesn't give anybody anything. There's no such thing as a free lunch or free Wi-Fi, right?
Yeah.
So, the false consciousness idea, again, Marx is like, well, this applies to everybody under capitalism. Even the people at the top are kind of deceived into believing that competition is the only way a society can exist. Everybody seems to believe that desire for commodities is, should supersede all other drives. Okay, and of course, Marx believes that the proletariat not only should, but will rise up and seize control of the factors of production. Another kind of cliche from Marxism. It doesn't happen, apart from, the Soviet Union, right? And then China. But you don't get all these revolutions around Europe. You don't get, a transformation of the world into a huge communist utopia. And later thinkers like Adorno, who I mentioned earlier, other members of the Frankfurt School, have to deal with why that is. And then they look at what the experience is of life under capitalism. And you could argue for a lot of poor people, their lives were improved under capitalism because they got wages and, they had to be better treated by their employers because their employers became dependent upon them, which again, Marx and Engels had predicted in the Communist Manifesto. But one of those post-Frankfurt School thinkers was Guy Debord, who started out as an artist, became heavily politicized, heavily influenced by Marx. And in the Society of the Spectacle, which is his analysis of capitalism, it's published in 1958, Debord talks about a false consciousness of time. That the way that the advertising industry in the 50s was working, the emphasis as part of the affect of capitalism was that, okay, we're going to save you time. And you would be saved time through the introduction of labour-saving devices at home, so it saves you time and labour, but also kind of repurpose military technology, things like microwave ovens. That was military technology. It was turned into consumer goods. But also, one example that Debord uses is powdered soup, right? So that was military rations that were then made into consumer goods, so you don't have to go and make soup anymore. You don't even need to heat it up. You just put boiling water into it, right? And as Debord says, well, you think you've got all this free time, but really, what are you free to do with that time? Well, you're not really free under capitalism because you need to work, you need to generate surplus value, you need to, your time is actually taken up by labor, the work that you need to do, which is why one of his phrases was, never work. Then you have your leisure time, but your leisure time is quite often spent recovering from your labor or preparing to go back into your labor. But there's the kind of invention of a leisure economy in the 50s, the consumer leisure economy, which Debord says is another form of labor, where the emphasis is kind of put upon you to make use of your time away from work. And rather than you being productive, what you're supposed to do is consume. Not just
or doom scroll.
Or doom scroll, yeah. Well, he says, what you find, and he's talked specifically about America, he says, what you find people do with this increased free time is watch more television.
Mm.
And of course, one of the kind of key 50s commodities, is identifiable with the 50s, representative of the 50s, was the TV dinner. It's pre-prepared. You just have to put it in your oven, your new kind of self-cleaning oven. It's part of that kind of idealized 50s kitchen. And you put it in, you've got your 3 courses there. And it's designed to, you've got 2 forms of consumption that united in one commodity, the consumption of food and the consumption of television. You sit there and you consume TV while you're eating your largely pre-prepared meal. It's all chopped up for you. It's kind of, in the UK, they're called ready meals. You get them from supermarkets, and they're different from TV dinners. The things you're meant to just cook in the microwave.
Right.
And, that sort of thing. Or there's a quite posh chain of supermarkets in the UK called Marks and Spencer's, which does and for, a long time has done kind of posh gourmet versions of those things, right? So this is the kind of false consciousness idea that I think is sort of Gnostic adjacent, if you want to call it that. It's in The Invisibles, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. There was one issue in the second volume where you've got the Invisibles kind of standing, looking sort of startled, and the speech balloons are overlaid with kind of typewriter font, like the Courier font.
Yeah.
And, Ragged Robin says, "What's my revolutionary agenda, boss?" And King Mob says, "Consume." And that was a reference to the Situationists, to their idea of détournement, which in French means to ambush. So they as artists, said that they would never produce anything original because novelty was what drove capitalism. So instead, they would just make collages, or they would transform existing artworks, or existing advertising and so on, that kind of thing. They would subvert it. A kind of diluted modern version of that approach is what you see in Banksy. The artist Banksy, the kind of grill artist Banksy. Particularly like one of his images, which I think is called Napalm. It's got that. There's a kind of collage. It's got the image, the famous image from the Vietnam War is the young girl who's been scalded by napalm. And she's been led away by her wrists, on one side it's Ronald McDonald and the other side is Mickey Mouse, right? So it's a not very subtle commentary on capitalism. But, the situation is also, as I said, they opposed work. The idea was you would never work. And they saw capitalism as a kind of waking dream. As Guy Debord put it, under capitalism, it's a topsy-turvy world. A moment of the true is a moment of the false. Okay? So they tried to escape from that through what they called the dérive, to drift in French. So they would walk around the city late at night for days on end. They would sometimes take drugs, or sometimes they would just deliberately not sleep, as they would try and enter into this kind of sort of mystical state, that kind of hallucinatory state that would come with sleep deprivation or drug use. Some of them got interested in the occult, that kind of idea of, a kind of sort of rules-based occultist approach, that you would follow numbers that you would see on street signs or so on. The novel New York Trilogy's got an element of drift, of derive in it, as the narrator wanders around the city and gradually becomes another person. So they would do that, and they would try and kind of discover. They believed that work was evil in the way that some Gnostics did, and they believed that what life should be characterized as by a constant state of play. That they were influenced by surrealists, the Dadaists as well. And the idea of a kind of, sort of endless childhood. So they tried to experience that as well, to try and discover a new kind of experience of time that was different from the false consciousness of capitalism, which of course regulated by work, but also by leisure, which, as I said, they saw as another form of labor. That you were being constantly kind of programmed to consume. You're being constantly stimulated by the media, which was, of course, the engine of capitalism.
And there you have it, ya shining crazy diamonds. For all subs, get ready for another 40 minutes plus of high-octane Gnosis. David will continue taking us to some amazing places and providing insights galore. So much more on comic books, Gnostic television, radical philosophy, cultural deconstruction, and technosis. For the full simulation, please become a Patreon, AB Prime member, or Red Circle sub. Your support is the only thing keeping the lights of the Pleroma on, and I can't do it without you. Alright, for subs, led us to the second half of David's fantastic interview. This is what you get.